and we're a go.
Okay. Can you state your last name and spell it out?
Spears, S-P-E-A-R-S.
And then your first name and spell it.
John, J-O-H-N.
Okay. So we'll start off the first question. Where were you born?
Pensacola, Florida.
Okay. What's the date?
May 8th, 1964.
And then,
So they tell me.
who are your parents and what were their occupations?
My mom, Sharon Prescott Spears, and she was a nurse her whole life. And my dad, John Thad Spears, was a soldier, and then he was a journalist in print, radio, and TV for NBC in Detroit.
Oh, neat. Did you have siblings? And what were their names, genders?
I got one little brother, Scott, who is 13 years younger than me, and he's a literature professor in Tokyo, Japan.
Oh, wow. Did he ever consider serving?
I don't believe he did.
Okay.
He's a hippie.
How did your parents feel about you joining the Army or the service?
I grew up in a family that military service was pretty much considered normal. So my dad had a career in the Army. Both of my grandfathers were career military men who both of them, interestingly, served in the Army and then switched to the Air Force. In World War II, the Air Corps was still part of the Army, and after World War II, the Air Force became its own branch. So I have two grandfathers who started in the Army in World War II, went to the Air Corps, and then went to the Air Force and then retired out of that. And my mom's dad did he did 42 years of active duty. He actually had a congressional waiver to let him stay on active duty, and at that time, I think he had the most active duty service of any enlisted man in the military.
Yeah, but that's neat.
So yes, I grew up in a military environment and always around soldiers and people who served, so it was just very normal for me.
Gotcha. What were your primary and secondary schools or colleges that you attended?
In the military?
Yes.
Is that what they're asking, like my military?
I think they're wondering where you went to high school and college.
Oh, high school, I gotcha. I went to school in Michigan. I grew up most of my schooling was done in Michigan, in southern Michigan. And then I went to, when I got out of the service, I went to college at Eastern Michigan University. I moved back to Michigan because I was an in-state resident. And then I went to medical school at Michigan State University.
And then before you entered the service, did you have any jobs?
I did. I had one crappy job after another, but the job that I loved is I grew up working in a gun store when I was in like middle school and early high school and things like that, and learned how to do gunsmithing and bought and sold guns and did things like that. So that was a pretty good job.
Probably helped you with the military, knowing what you need to talk about.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's just, gun people are gun people.
Can you tell us about when you went into the military, when you were drafted, or did you enlist?
The draft in the United States ended, I want to say like 1974, 1975, somewhere in there. So the draft has been gone a very long time. I went on active duty in 1981, and that was part of the all-volunteer Army. So that started in the 1970s is where we transitioned to an all-volunteer Army. So I knew I wanted to join the Army my whole life. So in high school, I knew that I would be eligible to join the Army as soon as 17 if I could get my mom to sign. So my first year in high school, I told my school counselors that that's what I wanted to do, and that I wanted to graduate as early as possible so I could join the Army, because I wouldn't turn 18 until, I'm born in May, so it would be the senior year of my graduation, and I didn't want to wait that long. So every year I took summer school classes, just like you guys can do sometimes, and I got enough credits so that I was able to graduate the first part of my senior year, and then I went into the Army off to basic training while everybody else was still in high school.
Wow. Why did you decide to join? Not only because of your family, but like, did you feel you had a need?
Yeah, you know, looking back on it, I knew I just wanted to do something special with my life. You know, I didn't want to go to college necessarily. You know, I didn't have anything against it, and I knew I'd probably go someday, but I didn't want to do it right then. And I was just really motivated from an early age to like go do action guy stuff. You know, I just want to, my dad was airborne, was a paratrooper, and I just always grew up wanting to be a paratrooper too. I just wanted to jump out of planes and shoot guns and like go to foreign countries and kill commies and do stuff like that. And that's just how I grew up. So, you know, I went to a really large high school. I mean, there was like, we had a senior graduating class of like 400 kids, something like that. I think there was me and only one other person in my graduating class went into the military. So it was pretty unusual.
What branch did you enter?
I was in the Army,
Okay.
in the United States Army.
And why did you choose that branch?
Well, I never wanted to be in any of the services that didn't have an airborne element to it. Like being airborne, being a paratrooper was just like a big motivator for me. So that pretty much meant you were going to the Army. You know, my dad was Army, and you know, most of the veterans who I grew up around, you know, who'd served in Korea and Vietnam, and people I just always looked up to, you know, all basically had Army careers. But I had lots of people who I grew up around with who served in all the services. And you know, both of my grandfathers were career Air Force people and things like that. So I had a really wide exposure to like the experiences that they had and things like that. And while all of it sounded really interesting, I just always thought that that would be, you know, the coolest, and that's what I wanted to do. So that's why I went into the Army.
Yeah.
What type of training or schooling did you have? Like advanced course, warrant officer basics, or warrant officer advanced?
Well, it's my part of the Army, and my career in the Army was oriented around me doing the special job that I wanted to do. So my goal was to be in the United States Army Special Forces, or people will call that unit the Green Berets, which is true. And there is a very straightforward pathway to get to do that. You don't get to join Special Forces like off the street, you know, joining as a kid and all of that. You have to be a non-commissioned officer. It means you already have to be a sergeant. You have to already be airborne qualified. You have to already be a paratrooper. And that's something that takes usually 3 or 4 years in the Army to build up all of those schools and experience and qualifications and maturity before you can go try out for Special Forces, or what's called going to selection. So I had just kind of a typical Army job, you know, my first few years in the Army, and was stationed at different places in the country, and had to wait until I could get my chance to go to airborne school at Fort Benning, and then I finally got through airborne school, and then I got assigned to a unit at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, which is where the 82nd Airborne Division is, and where the Center for Training for Special Forces is. And then I had to put my time in there before I finally got my chance to be selected to try out for Special Forces. So I spent several years in the Army just working up to that point to where I could go do the job I actually wanted to do. And then once I got to Special Forces, what's called the Special Forces Qualification Course is about a year of multiple phases of training. And then once you're qualified and you're being sent then to your Special Forces group and to the actual unit you work with, the A team, which is a 12-man detachment, you know, then other things like language school and sniper school and military free fall, Halo school, and you know, ranger school and scuba school and all those other kind of schools become available to you, and you get the opportunities to do all those different kind of things. So doing like what I did in special forces, it's just a life that you spend of going on mission after mission after mission, and then between missions going out to get advanced training, and then coming back and working, and then looking forward to the next advanced school that you go to, learning different skills and methods of infiltration and things like that. So more than anywhere else in the Army, when you're in special operations, your whole life is about constant training and going to schools.
Was that like for training for the special forces, was that a lot more rigorous in the training aspect than it was just training for the Army?
Oh yeah, you know, it's you know, your entry into any of the military services is there's always a basic training where you're learning how to be a soldier or a sailor or an airman, and you're getting, you know, inducted into military life and military discipline, and learning how to wear your uniform, and you know, understanding what the uniform code of military justice is, and understanding the rank structure. So all of that everybody goes through it's a difficult transition for anybody. It may not necessarily be like the physically hardest thing that you've ever done, but it's a challenge for everybody. You're moving into a new part of society and things like that. Once you get out of that, no matter what your job is, if you're like in the Army, and if you're like an artilleryman or an infantryman or an engineer, or if you're a motor vehicle mechanic or whatever your job is, you know, once you learn your specialty and learn your job, then you're spending the next several years just doing that job and learning how to be a junior soldier and learning principles of leadership and things like that. When you're going past that, and then you're going into especially special operations forces, you know, and in the Army, that's the special forces, that's the name of the unit, the U.S. Army Special Forces. There's only one unit that is special forces.
Oh, wow.
Everybody else is special operations forces, like the Navy SEALs and the Marine Special Operations Command. They're part of special operations forces. In the Army, the other major special operations force is the Ranger Regiment. The Rangers are airborne light infantry troops whose specialty is assaults and raids and airfield seizures and things like that, you know. So anybody who goes into that pipeline of training where that's what they want to do, they want to be a special operator, they want to do things like that. Yeah, to get to do all of that, there's months and sometimes even years of selection and training and performance of which you're being judged and measured every day.
Oh wow.
You know, and it just goes on. It goes on your whole career. The old saying is, is that selection is every day. It's not enough to like have finished a school and have the badge or have the tab or something like that. Every day you're doing the job, and you're being judged on how you're doing it by those around you as well as yourself.
Wow.
So it's like selection is a never-ending process,
Oh.
and you only want people around you who want to be there.
Yeah.
And every day they're working, and everything they're doing is so that you're able to do the job and come home alive.
Yeah.
What was your most vivid memory of your time in training or in school?
Wow, there's so many, you know, because I spent 7 years of active duty, and I spent 4 years of those on an A team in the 7th Special Forces group.
What about
And,
the best memory?
Oh, I mean, just to say, it's like I have so many. You know, I remember in the last phase of the Special Forces qualification course, the last phase of that is an unconventional warfare exercise that's called Robin Sage. And the Robin Sage exercise is you're being assembled into 12-man A teams, and you're practicing the mission that Special Forces actually does called unconventional warfare, where that classic mission is you're infiltrating into a foreign country to link up with a guerrilla force and an underground who's waging a war against their host country, and you're going in and you're training and leading them in combat operations and things like that. So that's a whole exercise and what all your training really builds up to. So the infiltration jump that we had to do into Robin Sage, it's a combat jump under combat conditions. So it's a night jump, which is not unusual, but you're carrying all of the gear and equipment that you need for the next 2 weeks. That means all your food, all your ammunition, all your demolition, all your batteries for radios, your weapons, everything. If you're not jumping in with it, you don't have it. So that jump, we all figured out, your static line parachute and your reserve, as I recall, I think it weighed somewhere around 60 to 80 pounds. With jumping what we call an exposed weapon, with your rifle, with all of your load carrying equipment, and most importantly with your rucksack. My rucksack, I weighed it, and my infiltration jump rucksack was 130 pounds.
Oh, wow.
So that with weapon, ammo, water, food, demo, medical gear, and everything in my rucksack, I was at that time, pretty scrawny, 6'2" guy, running dozens of miles a day, carrying a rucksack everywhere. I wasn't the 200-pound guy, that I was then. I weighed about 160 pounds. So I was carrying my own body weight in equipment on that jump. Generally in peacetime, I'm a jump master, but I'm a little rusty on these things. The exiting altitude from the aircraft is usually 1,250 feet. Simulating combat operations, you can have special permission to exit the aircraft. I think, as I recall, it was like 600 feet. And that's a really quick exit. When you jump out of the aircraft and you're waiting for the deployment sequence of your parachute to open up and to provide you, some lift, and then have time to orient yourself, and then your rucksack is attached to your body by a long cord that's hooked to a D-ring on the rig of your parachute, and then you have a really long, it's like about a 10-foot essentially tether that's all S-rolled and Velcroed and things like that. So when you're landing, you release your rucksack below you, it hangs below you, and when you're trying to figure out where the ground is and getting ready to do your parachute landing fall, the rucksack hits the ground, and then a second later you hit the ground. Well, in this jump, the conditions for this infiltration jump, there was complete cloud cover and there was not a star or any moon in the sky.
Oh, wow.
So when I exited the aircraft, I had no sense or orientation of where the horizon was or where the ground was or anything else like that. And the sequence that you go through when you exit the aircraft, and then you check your canopy, and then you orient to where you're at and things like that, I remembered I looked up and I checked my canopy, I reached up and I grabbed my risers to grab the toggles to steer my chute. I looked to see if I could see the horizon, and I couldn't see the drop zone, or I couldn't see the horizon, and I hit the ground. I had about a 5 or 6 second count from the time I left the aircraft until I hit the ground, carrying 160 pounds of gear without being able to lower my rucksack, and I just hit the ground like a bag of wet cement. And I laid there for a second, couldn't breathe, my ears were ringing, and I was just trying to make sure I was alive, and all of a sudden I'm thinking to myself, I figured it out, and I did the calculations years later, because I was a jump master, and figured out the Air Force must have exited us somewhere below 500 feet.
Oh, wow.
Because we had that rapid of a a descent and
Yeah.
things like that. So anyway, that was a really bad jump, and I ended up breaking my foot on that jump. And that's the last step. Those 2 weeks on that exercise, it's all that's separating you from getting your Green Beret.
Oh, shoot.
So I walked on that broken foot for the next 2 weeks with a 160-pound rucksack and equipment. And I never took my boot off that whole 2 weeks because I was afraid if I took it off and my foot swole, I would never be able to get my boot back on again. And then I'd have to start that phase all over again. So
Wow.
I had one of my best friends actually broke his femur on that jump. And had to get surgery, and then he had to sit out like 6 months before he could go back and finish that last phase of training. And I was glad that I walked on that broken foot for 2 weeks, and it just felt like, being poked with a hot poker constantly.
Yeah.
Because I finished and I got to graduate and get my Green Beret, and my buddy who broke his femur, it took him another 6 months to be done.
Wow.
So
Do you still have like problems with that foot, or did it heal up?
everybody who you talk to in the military who did anything that was very physical is pretty beat up and has permanent injuries from the things they did,
True.
during their youth in the military.
Yeah.
So, pain is just something you deal with.
Does any particular instructor or mentor stand out to you?
I was very lucky I can say that at every stage of my military career that I had leaders who took a personal interest in my well-being. I've talked to guys over the years, comparing military service, who said that they had a terrible experience and they didn't enjoy it. And when I talk to them and they talk about the experiences they had and the people who were supposed to be helping them and looking out for them who were not doing so, that is 100% the difference. From the time I was a private, I remember having people, squad leaders, platoon sergeants, section leaders, first sergeants, sergeant majors, even the officers. I can remember having a battalion commander who, me as a little bitty, 17-year-old E1 nothing private, who took a personal interest in me and let me know that I was important and that, that I needed to do a good job and people depended on me and things like that. So for me, I just noticed that, and that was true, that I had people who were leaders, who were setting example for me, who made me want to do a better job, and who always had the time to teach me and make sure that I was improving, and that happened all the way. But in Special Forces, it's a very special relationship because you're working on a very small unit, a 12-man team, and the people on that team you're very, very close to. And the senior non-commissioned officer on the team is who we call the team sergeant. And like the team sergeant I had on my longest serving A team was like my father, my best friend, my big brother, my buddy and all of that. He was the guy I always wanted to be. There is no problem I ever had, no bad situation we were ever in where it's like you couldn't look to him and he wouldn't know what to do or how to get out of it. So yeah, I was lucky. I had so many people who were influential to me, and I'm an old man. I'm almost 55 years old. Decades later in my life, there are things that I hear in my head that I was taught as a teenager or as a 20-year-old in Special Forces that to this day affect how I treat other people or how I talk to other people or how I help other people solve problems, because they're things that I learned so early in life, and I do a lot of the things I do the same way that I was taught by those people.
Wow. What was your first assignment after basic training?
I was assigned to the 7th Infantry Division in Fort Ord, California, which doesn't exist anymore. That's how old I am. It was a base that's on the Monterey Bay area of California, the Monterey Peninsula, and I'm a kid who grew up between North Florida and Michigan, and as 17-year-old, know-nothing private, I'd never even been to California, much less to the Pacific Coast before, and it was amazing. You know, you guys have been to Monterey and know what that place is like, right?
Yeah.
It's like this beautiful bay, and it's where the cliffs meet the sea, and you can hear the sea lions all the time, and it's a big touristy area, and it's July and you're on the beach, but it's 65 degrees and you need a sweater on, and it's perfectly sunny. So that made a big impression on me. You know, the Army right off the bat sent me to a place that I'd never been before, could never imagine going, and it had a huge effect on my life. I've loved the California coast the rest of my life, and and me and my family go to Monterey sometimes, you know, every year to visit, because, you know, I fell in love with the area as a 17-year-old private.
Yeah.
Did you receive any promotions, and could you tell us about it?
Well, I had several promotions, and when I left active duty, I was a staff sergeant, which is an E6, and I was on the promotable list. I was accepted to become a sergeant first class, an E7, when I left after 7 years of active duty. So, you know, that's a pretty normal career progression in special forces. Is the promotions are fairly regular and rapid, doing what you do.
What was the hardest part of military lifestyle that you had to adapt to, and why do you think it was the hardest?
That's a great question. For somebody like me, it wasn't difficult. Like, I enjoyed military life. When I finally got going in the military, and you get to your first duty station and you're doing things like that, it was really comfortable for me. You know, I enjoyed it. You know, there wasn't anything that was difficult. I think, you know, initially it's kind of difficult. Like, you know, I have one little brother, you know, but there was like, he was still basically just getting out of diapers when I left to join the Army, you know, so I pretty much like always had my own bedroom growing up and things like that. And, you know, in the Army, of course, you're all, you know, in barracks together and things like that. But even as like a, you know, as a private and all of that, living in a room with like 4 other guys, you know, who, if you're stuck with somebody who like snores all night, you know, when I was that first duty station at Fort Ord, California, I had 4 roommates. One of the guys was a great guy named Dean Motoyama, who was from Hawaii, who was my buddy. And there was another guy who was a really nice guy, but he had a girlfriend in town, so he stayed in town, and he rarely ever slept in the room. And then we had a 4th roommate who was a little older than us, and when we were privates, that guy was an E4, a specialist, and he worked in the mail room in the headquarters company, and he snored from the second he closed his eyes until he woke up, and it was torture. We would lay in bed at night, and if you didn't go to sleep before that guy fell asleep, you were never going to get to sleep.
Oh.
And we would throw things at him to try and get him to stop snoring. We would shake his bed, and he would wake up, and then he'd just turn over and go to sleep, and then he would forget about it and things like that. We'd put his hand in warm water to try and make him pee the bed. We would, you know, put shaving cream in his hand and scratch his nose to try and make him hit himself in the face with shaving cream. He would wake up in the morning, and I don't understand, he would never connect it, but there would be boots and coins and books and anything we could grab in the room that we would throw at him to try and get him to wake up and stop snoring. And finally, after like going through that for a year, they gave the guy a private room and we didn't have to sleep with him anymore in the same room. But I can say if there was anything that was hard to adjust to about military life, we'd sleep with earplugs in, or we'd put our headphones on and listen to our Walkmans, and we'd do anything. But yeah, when you're stuck with a roommate who has a terrible habit like that, life is pretty tough, and that I never appreciated.
Sure.
So, were you in combat support, or service support roles?
My role was combat arms. I was an 18 Delta Special Forces medic and a Special Forces operator in the 7th Special Forces Group. And my role was unconventional warfare, direct action, special operations, and foreign internal defense. And in those years, I was based out of the Republic of Panama with the forward element for the 7th Special Forces Group, and I spent that portion of the 1980s serving in combat in hazardous duty environments all over Central and South America. I was a Special Forces advisor in the war in El Salvador from 1985 to 1989. I worked in Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru in counter-narco-terrorism operations, helping to direct operations for DEA and the Narcotics Assistance Unit in all of those countries. Participated in the counterinsurgency operations in Peru, and many other countries around that part of the world. So yes, my role was in combat and in special operations.
How did your combat wartime experience change you, and like what kind of friendships did you take from it?
Yeah, any time you spend with other people in an environment that's stressful and where there's danger, you become very close to people. You become close to other people in the military regardless. Number one, because most people who join the military, or they may not look like you, they may not be where you're from, they may not be the same religion, they may not have the same accent, but they're already people who are very like you, right? They have the same kind of basic beliefs and values, or they wouldn't be there in the first place. And then when you have a lot of shared hardships and experiences, you become even closer to people, being in environments like combat and things like that, you share experiences that you can't share any other way. And the people who I served with and the people who I deployed to all of those countries with, I'm very lucky. They're people who, most of them, I'm still in contact today. 30, 35 years later, I still know most of those people who are still alive. Friends who we lost, who we still remember together, and we talk about them all the time. Facebook is funny. I always thought it was funny and made fun of it and things like that. But it's like I keep in contact with people who I knew from my earliest days in Special Forces from when I was 20. And now it's 35 years later. So there's no question that those experiences change you. In a lot of ways, you find out who you are and what you can really do. The other thing is it forges those bonds with the other people you serve with that are sometimes they're more special than the family you were born with.
Yep. So what did you do when you're off duty for recreation, like free time?
Well, things are so much different in my period of service through the decade of the 80s and the early 90s than they are now. When I was stationed in a cool place like California, there was always something to do, right? We were poor. As a private E1, I made $341 a month, and $100 of that came right off the top because it went into educational savings that I later used for college. And then when you used to monthly get paid, as I recall, I think I'd get about $200 cash. You know, so nobody had a car, nobody had transportation, you know, nobody could go anywhere, things like that. So, you know, when you were had some money in your pocket and you were off duty, you know, we'd all get together, and if we couldn't bum a ride off somebody or we couldn't get a bus, we just splurge on a taxi and we go downtown and we get a really nice meal. And then everybody, we would go to a bookstore and we would get some books to read for entertainment, because everybody, you know, loved reading and things like that. And then basically we just walk around Monterey, which is one of the most beautiful places on earth, and then we'd go back to post, and on post, in your off-duty time, you know, everything is right there, you know, within walking distance of where your barracks are and where you work and things like that. So, you know, the mess hall, the dining facility is right there, so you got 3 free meals a day, you know. You've got a snack bar right down the road, so if you're hungry and you want a snack, you can't go to your refrigerator, you go to the snack bar and you get a banana and a yogurt or something like that and you hang out. There's movie theaters all over Post. Like back then on that Post, there was like 3 or 4 movie theaters.
Wow.
So if you were bored and just wanted something to do, you'd just go see a movie, and you had a choice of 3 or 4 movie theaters to go to, and it was like, you know, $2 or something like that for a soldier to go see a movie. You know, they had gyms and swimming pools, and I mean, they had vocational shops where if you enjoyed woodworking or welding or metalworking or something like that, and you had the time, you could go do all of that stuff. So it's like the ability to do like recreation and hobbies and just like enjoy yourself in a military community, it's all right there for you right on base. You don't even have to leave post, you know.
Oh, wow.
But of course, when you live in a really cool place like Monterey, you want to be off post, you know, out, you know, in the community, because it's like the most beautiful place on earth. And when I left Fort Ord, and then I went to jump school, and then I got to be in an airborne unit at Fort Bragg, and now I'm in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, there was nothing to do. Going downtown to like Fayetteville, North Carolina is nowhere you wanted to be. You know, there was nothing to do. It was a really boring place. And on the post, it's such a huge post, and there's so many soldiers on there, you know, trying to go to the rec center and like, you know, sign out a guitar and go to a room to play guitar or something like that. There'd be 20 guys who had already done that, you know. So there was a big change in life when I went from a great place like Fort Ord, California, in Monterey, to like Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and that's when soldiers start drinking and fighting and getting into trouble, because there's not enough to do.
Gotcha.
But I never did that.
Do you recall the day service ended?
I recall it for this reason. After a few years in Panama, and I left the service in Panama, I went from Panama, from Howard Air Force Base to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, to out-process the Army, and I was only there for a day. What I did was I transferred into the reserves, but then I went back to southern Michigan to see my family. The day I left Howard Air Force Base in Panama, before I got on the aircraft, I looked at the control tower, and the temperature said it was 115 degrees. I went to South Carolina that day. The next morning I out-processed, and then I got on a plane and I flew into Detroit Metro Airport. And when I got to my parents' house and I looked at the thermometer, it was 15 degrees. So I'd gone from a 100-degree difference the day I left Panama to when I got to my parents' house, and I didn't leave the house for 3 weeks. I didn't own enough clothes to keep me warm.
Oh wow.
So that's what I remember about the day I left the Army.
Oh, I bet.
Whenever you came back, did you go back to school or did you work?
Yeah, I did all of that. Had a short period of time where I did some contracting for the government back in South America, in Colombia. And then I just decided I need to stop messing around, and then that fall I started college. So I had jobs, and I went to college, and I taught martial arts, and I was still in the reserves, in the Special Forces reserves, so I'd have monthly weekend meetings and things like that, and it was a busy time.
Did you join a veteran organization afterwards?
No, I was always a member of the Special Forces Association, so I kept in contact with, other Special Forces guys there, but staying in the reserves gave me people to associate with and to relate to, who were from my background, even though now I was a civilian.
And seeing those people that kind of help transition or help with the transition of going back into everyday life.
Yeah, I know a lot of people who've, did like I did 6 to 10 years and left to go do something else. People who spent their 20, 25, sometimes 30 years in the Army and retired. And people who did a career who were enlisted, who left as master sergeants or sergeant majors at the top end of the scale. I have friends who are officers who retired as lieutenant colonels or colonels. It doesn't matter who you are or how long you served. Getting out, everybody just does the best they can. It doesn't matter if you're ready to get out. It doesn't matter if there were things that you missed. It doesn't matter if you hated the Army. It doesn't matter when you get out. It is in some ways like the worst part of your life. And it really was for me. The transition was terrible. Yeah. I spent every day, the first probably 4 years I was out of the Army, I got up and I looked in the mirror every day and asked myself if today was the day I was going to quit and go back to the Army, because it was just so hard being a civilian.
Wow.
It was just not fun. I didn't like the people around me. All the terrible jobs I had were terrible. Even the reserves wasn't very rewarding because the people I was with just weren't the same quality of the people that I had served with in an active duty Special Forces unit. School was not fun. The people I went to school with I couldn't relate to. So, I had a goal of getting through college and doing things like that, but it's every day I wanted to quit and just join the Army again.
What are some life lessons you learned from being in the military?
Well, there's a lot, but I think, the way I put it is a lot of times people will talk to me about, joining the military, or a lot of people my age who have kids who are teenagers who, think about joining the military, and their parents ask me, hey, you're the only guy I know who served in the military, would you do it? Would you tell a kid to join the military and things like that? And the way I always say it is, you'll never regret it. Even if you don't want to do a career, the things that you learn and the things that you do will change your life, and it will make you a better person. The biggest part that I think that people forget is, it really boils down to this. Honorable service is its own reward. The pride and the sense of accomplishment that you carry with you the rest of your life from serving honorably is a feeling that can't be reproduced in any other way that I know of. And that's irrespective of what you did in the military. It doesn't matter if you were a fighter pilot or a ranger or a paratrooper or a Marine, or if you did action guy stuff, or if you worked in a hospital and were a laboratory technician in the military, or if you were a clerk, or you were in non-combat arms. It doesn't matter. That feeling that you served honorably and that you did the job you were supposed to do and served your country and did everything the right way is just the best feeling that nobody can ever take away from you, and you'll have it for the rest of your life.
Thank you for taking the time to share recollections of your military service. Is there anything you would like to add that we have not covered yet?
Oh, I'm lucky. I had a great experience, and you know, and I would love to know that other people are doing the same. You know, our country's been in a really tough time since 2001. You know, since 9/11, the country has been through a tough time. When you guys see movies and read books about World War II, for guys who served in World War II, most of those guys served for a year, they served for 2 or 3 years. If you've ever seen like that show, The Band of Brothers, about a unit in the 101st Airborne Division in World War II. They trained for several years, and they jumped into Normandy on D-Day, and their war was over in about a year. I have friends who have deployed to Afghanistan or Iraq 15 times. I have friends who well after I left the service have kept fighting and have been in that part of the world fighting and bleeding and dying for 15 years and more, who've really sacrificed for this country. And the guys who are doing that right now are the guys who need to go down in history as the greatest generation, because they've done more for this country than anybody has ever done before, and we've asked a lot of them. So everybody's service is valuable, and everybody's service has been honorable, and I'm grateful to everybody who's served. But the guys who are serving right now, they need to be remembered forever for what they're doing, and I wish I was young enough to be there and help them out. So thanks for taking the time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
How do you turn this off? Yeah.
Hit the red button. Always hit the red button. Button. Who's